beautiful one with Dr. Stephanie Barnes, who has come all the way from Georgia. And here she's going to speak about mastering organizational excellence through systems thinking and strategies. So, hoping for a wonderful session. Over to you, Doctor. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And first of all, I just want to thank all of you. I mean, you have come to a 6 o'clock session, so I really do appreciate your diligence, because I know this has been a long day and we've had a lot of really great things going on throughout the week. So thank you so much for being here. So what I wanted to do was just to have a conversation around this concept of organizational excellence and how you can achieve that through systems thinking and strategies. And I'm a former healthcare attorney, and I worked for a health system and had the responsibility for risk management and compliance and contracts. And one of the things that I readily appreciated was that if I wanted to reduce lawsuits in my company, because that was what my responsibility was to respond to and address the different threats that can happen in a healthcare system when you have, resulting injuries from medication errors and, all of the different things that can go wrong. And I readily appreciated that if I really wanted those lawsuits to go away, I couldn't just respond to them when they popped up. And I really had to get involved at the front end and get to understand, what led to the resulting lawsuits, or what led to the errors that could cause the company to be sued. And so I was not a very traditional lawyer in that I was really interested in understanding the people who were on the front line, getting to know the nurses, the doctors, the clinicians throughout, and getting them to think about the healthcare that they delivered from a systems perspective. And so I'm going to share with you a lot of the things that I learned and how we can apply those, whether it's in a big organization as well as even in our small businesses, and really thinking about how we want to achieve quality, how we want to achieve excellence from a systems perspective. And a systems perspective really boils down to 3 concepts. Systematic, doing things a certain way for a certain reason, being deliberate about the things that you do, as opposed to just showing up, I wonder if it's going to work out, but really being deliberate around that process. The second thing is continuous. The second concept, rather, is being continuous. Something that is a fabric, a part of the fabric of your day, the way you deliver your services, your products, the way that you go about your business. So this is something that can't be a flavor of the week activity. It has to be something that is continuous and a part of the fabric of who you are and who your organization is. And then the third concept is consistent, because you develop these systems, these processes, these consistent way of doing, or these continuous way of doing things by having consistency in what you do and understanding the process and committing to it and learning from the day-to-day activities. So those are the 3 concepts that we will discuss as we look through this, and I hope that you can picture this as a continuum, a cycle. Again, because it's continuous, these are different steps, but it's all intended to be a process where you are committing to it in a way where it just works as a system and as a cycle for you. So in the middle here, I have identified this dedicated organizational excellence function. And what I mean by that is, if you're in a big organization, it can be a department, right? It can be, when you have, a director, or you have someone who's responsible for a unit. It can actually be a functioning unit in a company. But in a small business or in a smaller organization, it just simply means that there is someone who is responsible for making sure that the organization is going through this cycle and making sure that this remains a priority, and again, is something that's consistent and continuous as opposed to something that's haphazard. So as you think about that, and even, in your own personal excellence accomplishments or efforts, it's all about having a dedicated function, a way that each day or each quarter, each cycle of your business, that this is a part of what you do. So I want to start with the first step in developing a system for organizational excellence, and that is understanding and identifying your risks and your opportunities. And I'm going to look at those from two different perspectives. Because, an organization, your business, it's something that's fluid. And it's not, there are a lot of different influences that factor into your relative success at any time. And usually it boils down, it's either an opportunity or a risk. And even risks can present opportunities when it's part of this process where you're identifying them proactively rather than reacting to them once they come up. So it's really important to have some kind of function where you are consciously identifying at any given time what your risks and opportunities are, because this allows you then to prioritize resources, to understand where your human capital needs to be deployed, what changes you need to make in your system, and how these risks and opportunities are going to influence your business outcomes. So that's the first thing, is having a dedication to identifying that. The second part, as you go around there, is having committed performance improvement activities. And, again, this can be very elaborate, where you have, you may engage Six Sigma methodologies, lean methodologies. There are all of these different performance improvement methodologies out there, but the point here is to have some component of your day-to-day activities where you are identifying your opportunities to improve, so that when you have things that don't go as you would like for them to go, you can learn from those opportunities and you don't repeat that. Because one of the things that I found, in my responsibilities as General Counsel and having to oversee the results of errors was that oftentimes those things that rose to be very severe issues were those where there was not this process of really understanding what went wrong. And, usually it was a process issue. Sometimes it was just pure human error, human behavior, human inaction or action. But usually there was a process where, without the active identification of, what the process breakdown was, it was something that was inevitable to recur. So that's something that's really important, is to have identified and dedicated performance improvement activities. And again, it can be something simple as at the end of a project or the end of some service delivery to ask the question, what did we do right? What could we have done better? And the reason those are the two simple questions that performance improvement activities boil down to is, a lot of times we only focus on what did not go right, what did we do wrong, what could we have done better. And certainly there is information that is inherent in that question. But if you want to have consistent and continuous service excellence, product excellence, you need to be aware of what you're doing right so that you can replicate that. Because if you don't specifically identify that, it kind of becomes a serendipity. And so you don't really identify what it is that is working. And so it's important that your performance improvement activities basically boil down to those two questions. Now, this next part of the cycle is education. And this is where a lot of organizations don't fully appreciate the investment of resources into educating the people. Because you can have great technology, you can have great capital structures, great buildings, great contracts and things that you're bringing in to generate revenue, but if you don't invest in your people, then you're not going to have the outcomes that, or as good of outcomes as you could if your people are operating at the same level of proficiency as the technology that you utilize. So education boils down to basically two types of education. You have adaptive education, adaptive learning, and generative learning. Now, adaptive learning are those basic skills, those technical skills that your people need that are specific to your industry. So if you're in a manufacturing industry, it's being skilled at the particular equipment that they have or the tools that they're using, okay? And if you're in a healthcare setting, it is the different clinical competencies that a clinician needs in order to deliver care in a proficient way. But the second component of that is generative learning, which is where oftentimes the resources are not deployed, and that is helping your people to be better people, to be better at communicating with others, to be better in the instance of leadership, to be better leaders. Because even though, we are often born with certain leadership traits, it still is something that must be cultivated. And, leadership, great leadership doesn't happen by accident. It happens through a systematic approach, a continuous approach, and being consistent at certain competencies. And it's important to make sure that the people who are responsible for delivering the service or product or creating the product in your organization are the best people, the best human capital that they can be. So it's important to have this education component. And then the other aspect of education that goes along here is actually communicating with the people who are delivering the services to make sure that there is a consistent way that vital information gets, that it flows from the top and from the grassroots to the top. And it has to be a dual process, because it's important to, when you're thinking about achieving organizational excellence, to recognize that even though it has to be driven by, say, the CEO and driven by senior leadership, it still has to involve input that comes from those who are on the front line. Because while certainly those who are in senior leadership positions are very knowledgeable, they have expertise, they have been in the industry for a long time, at some point you become a little bit removed from what's going on the front line, just by nature of how you're positioned in the company. So it's really important to speak to those people who are actively interfacing with your clients, interfacing with your customers, who are actively working on machines if you're in a manufacturing setting, who are actively, have access and first-hand access to that input about how things are working. So it's really important when you're thinking about education to think about it as improving your people, improving yourself, because, as a leader, you're not exempt from this process and need to be actively involved and lead by example. So, being involved in making yourself and making the people better, but also ensuring that they are getting information timely, they're getting information relevant information, and that they're getting accurate information. Because one of the things that I'm sure all of you can relate to is, when we don't have all of the information, we have imaginations. And our imaginations begin to fill in the gaps. And oftentimes, we fill in the gaps with inaccurate information. And it's done in good faith, and sometimes perhaps not. But if you want to achieve organizational excellence, it's important to be proactive in that regard and make sure that you have ways of doing that. And this can be, as simple as having, regular and consistent ways of delivering it at the unit level, whether that's a department or a work group. Having, if in today's technology, or with today's technology, we can take advantage of intranet delivery of information, communication boards. There's just all of these different ways to be sure that those things that are relevant and important are being delivered to those who need that information. And so the next part of this cycle is validation. And it's really important, you know, when you are determining whether your service or product delivery is excellent or not, is that you have an objective way of determining that. Because it does you no good to get in a meeting and say, oh, great, we're doing wonderful. Do you feel good about what we're doing? Do you feel good about it? Okay, great, we're doing good. You know, it has to be validated by metrics that are relevant to your industry, that are relevant to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So it's really important to have benchmarks. And, you know, and to make sure that those benchmarks focus on the areas that are going to influence your outcome. So usually that's a metric that looks at how your people are performing. You know, so there's some type of employee or people measurement, and that can be looking at their personal employee satisfaction. It can be looking at, you know, their different competency levels, but something that measures the people, something that measures the stakeholders, or a metric that is relevant to your stakeholders, and those can be internal stakeholders or external stakeholders. So this could be your customers if you are in a regulated industry. It could be something that's related to those who have governance responsibilities for you, and then looking at, you know, who are you accountable to, essentially. How would they measure you, and how do you stand up to that? Some type of financial metric. You know, it could be the cost of delivering your service. It could be, you know, looking at your accounts receivable. You know, there are lots of different financial metrics that influence how well you're going to perform from a financial perspective. And then also looking at your ultimate customers. You know, how do you measure how your customers or your clients view you as an organization? So it's really important that when you are looking at how you're doing and determining where what your current level is and where you would like to go, that you have objective metrics that help you to define that. And as you're looking at this validation process, you again want to look at your metrics from where you are right now, and then look at setting long-term goals. Because certainly it's something that should be revisited. You know, for some metrics, they may move on a monthly basis. Your accounts receivable, usually your financial metrics, you're going to look at those on a 30-day cycle. Your patient satisfaction, your customer satisfaction, your employee satisfaction, those may be things that you look at on a 30-day cycle. Others you may look at in a quarterly cycle. Some of them may be annual. But it's important that you know what's relevant and that you're measuring things that make an impact on your business. Because it shouldn't be about busy work and you just, you know, have this pretty little scorecard and you have colors and all of this and it looks great, but it's not really meaningful, and it becomes something that is resented by those who have to prepare it. So, you know, you want to make sure that, you know, usually there are like 50 million metrics that you can look at for any given area. But usually it's only about 5 that are really going to make an impact on your success. So if those are the only 5 that are really going to be meaningful, then focus on those. Because this process can be very overwhelming when, you know, you're not deliberate about what it is that you're doing, and you're not selecting activities and measurements and different reports and things that are meaningful and relevant to what you're doing. So as you, again, are determining how you're going to validate excellence, you want to make sure that it's not done in such an overwhelming capacity that it is basically now another job just collecting all of the information. And the reason that you collect this information is to ensure that you're making data-driven decisions. Because a lot of times we make emotional decisions in our business, we make reactive decisions to what's going on, and at the end of the day, it's very important to ensure that you're making data-driven decisions. So what are the metrics telling you? So if the metrics are telling you that you need to make adjustments in this area, then any deviation from that needs to be supported by something other than, well, we don't want to do that. We would prefer to spend our time elsewhere. And that way, you are able to justify what it is that you're doing, and it's backed by the relevant and meaningful data. And so the last part of this is looking at publication and reporting, because it's really important to have accountability in your organizational excellence efforts. And oftentimes the best way to be accountable is to have to tell someone about it. Because I remember in my healthcare organization for which I worked, we had quality metrics that were publicly available to any patient or any physician or any community member at any given time. So it wasn't like if we were unsuccessful at a metric that we could bury our heads in the sand. Someone was going to know exactly where we were in our quality performance. And so that served as a big incentive for us to be sure that we were paying attention to those metrics and responding to them and ensuring that we were consistently improving in those areas. So publication is a great way of generating accountability. So if you're not in a regulated industry, there's not some oversight government agency or private oversight agency that is looking at your metrics and making them publicly available, then you also want to look at the publication of that information throughout the organization, because typically managers of different units or different work groups, they want to be excellent in their own right. And having friendly competition, if you will, among those business units is a way to generate accountability, but also to ensure that everybody understands where they are in the process. And as you're looking at this system, one of the things that I found to be a very important exercise in healthcare delivery was to make sure that everyone in that delivery system knew how the quality of their unit impacted someone else in the organization. So I'm just going to use a healthcare entity because that was the entity that I worked for. So you have patient access. That's where people come into the hospital, right? Where they're registered, where you get the correct demographics information, where you get the correct insurance information, where the process gets started. Well, if you don't get the correct information there, it impacts that patient's experience throughout the cycle. But if the registration clerk in patient access doesn't understand that, he or she may not put forth the diligence to get the best information that they can, because it's just kind of something that, I'm just showing up for work and put this stuff in the computer. But it's really important for people to understand where they are in that process and how the quality of their output impacts the quality upstream and downstream in an organization, which is part of the education process, it's part of the communication process, and it's also part of the publication process and making sure that people know exactly what's going on and how they impact everyone else in the organization. So I have gone through the overall system and shared with you, those different components. And what I'd like to do now is to get your input, because I'd like for this to be interactive, because like I said, this is the end of a very long day, and I don't want y'all to go to sleep on me. I want y'all to be very attentive. But I do want this to be an interactive exercise. So what I'd like to now do is to get your thoughts on how you have approached organizational excellence in your own entities or your own organizations, and where you have identified best practices, challenges, and just different experiences in this spectrum. And one of the things that you may find is that even though at this point you've not necessarily identified what you're doing as a dedicated organizational excellence function, you still may be doing this in your organization. It's just a matter of becoming systematic, continuous, and consistent about it to where you can define it as an organizational excellence function. So, with that, I would like to ask of you, what are your experiences with, or have you experienced any of these different concepts? And what are some things that we can share about helping our organizations to improve and to be more consistent in delivering service and products at a level of excellence? Yes. Yes.
So I was wondering, yeah, okay. Sorry, I have so many questions. I walk in late as well.
No.
It's like the most important thing for me right now.
That's great.
Yeah. So I run a startup, and it's also an impact-based startup, right? So if I look at the opportunity and the risk identification, it's basically the problem, right?
Right.
So the problem on the ground is basically agriculture, climate change, and small-scale farmers.
Okay.
So if we just take one problem, creating a market for the small-scale farmers. So that is the opportunity. Then the risk identification is that the supply chain is erratic. So we have fixed that. Then the performance improvement activities is also, we basically set goals. Like we say that we need to increase the selling activities of the farmers from A to B, right? And we set like, say, performance activity of say 3 months, that we have to create these many markets for them. Then what we do is then the education, which is at 2 levels. So one is actually education to the farmer level. So like we'll be like, okay, now you have to tell us if you can actually provide us with these many products. And then I go to my team and say that, listen, we have to increase sales by this much. Then after that, we validate and we cross-check that are we going to be able to actually create these many markets, and do we have that much supply? And then where we actually fail is a publication reporting, because I don't know what are the metrics to actually measure my impact, not only at the community level, but also the impact at the customer level, because it's such multi-pronged stages we are actually working. So we also don't have bandwidth. We don't know what kind of publication reporting. It needs to be as part of the system, so I'm really clueless. Yeah.
That's often a challenge, you know, for many different industries, particularly service delivery, where there's not published benchmarks that are out there. And so I often face this because I had a compliance department. I'll just give you some examples. So I had a compliance department as part of a healthcare system. Well, there just weren't very many benchmarks that I could look to set or to easily pull and use for my validation and reporting. So one of the things that I had to do was, you know, in identifying, you know, the stakeholders to which we reported, because, you know, I looked at things like, you know, I didn't want to have lawsuits, right? So I would look at the number of new lawsuits that were created each year and comparing those, you know, to previous years. So I had to create a benchmark based on past history. And if you're in a startup, well, you're not going to have years and years of data to pull from, but you do have the previous 30 days, the previous quarter. And so, you know, it's identifying, you know, those things that are going to make a difference in your business, and then beginning to develop history about, you know, when you look at the previous 30 days, when you look at the previous quarter, when you look at the year before, and using that to begin to set internal benchmarks that you create. And the publication and reporting, you know, it doesn't have to be anything elaborate, but it has to be meaningful to you. And so whether that is, you know, depending on how you communicate with your farmers, you know, is it making sure that, you know, they are aware of where they are, relative to the benchmarks that you've set, that you've identified that are meaningful to you. So, you know, the whole point of this is not to become something that's cumbersome and, you know, something that you're doing, but that it is meaningful to you. And sometimes you have to tweak it. And the challenge with benchmarks that you create is that you have to avoid the temptation to tweak them to meet, to make your performance look better. You know, once you set it, you need to commit to using that benchmark for a certain period of time, and usually don't change them more frequently than a year at a time. So you can at least see, is this benchmark working? Is it something that's relevant? And then make tweaks, you know, in your next cycle. So hopefully that answered your question. Okay, great. Yes?
Can I just add? Sure.
Because we do this so we can pick up on it again. Yes, okay.
I just wanted to say to your specific problem, sometimes working with your customers as to what information they can provide you, what they track. It's not about you inventing the wheel. Go and ask them what they have information on and what they're willing to share with you. And just an example from my own background, we had a lot of problems with stockouts of anti-malarial drugs in Africa when I was working for a pharmaceutical company, and we had no systems. We had no inventory system, we had nothing, and basically we got the pharmacists to text us when they had no drugs. So use what you have. Don't think, well, I haven't got a reporting system, I haven't got SAP. It's like, no, but everyone's got a phone, you know, a text message. Maybe you offer them a discount if they send you a text message every week telling you the delivery was on time, or, you know, there's, like you were saying, how much they could produce. Find a way that you can communicate using what you already have, rather than worrying about ticking boxes about systems and things like this. And the systems will come, believe me.
Right.
When you get to a certain scale, the right system will come along to make your life a lot easier. But until you get to that point, you don't, you know, excel and use what you've got.
Right.
I have a question. My question is slightly different from what you have spoken.
Okay.
Right. I need to understand that for a startup, or anyone who's beginning his business, like he has to chalk out a framework. And in the framework, he has to designate the duties and the funds as well. So, how much percentage should he keep for what? If that can be decided, or it can be, you know, is there any framework like this is, for a startup, this is more important, and for a startup, this is not required. So, like, you know, at times decision making becomes very confusing. Where to invest and where not to invest.
Because kind of 2 points about startups as it relates to developing systems. That's the best time to have a discipline about what you do, because then you don't develop bad habits, okay? So that's why it's really important for a startup, as early as you can, to have, again, that dedicated organizational excellence function, just thinking like it, okay? So again, it's not about complexity as much as it is about relevance and developing good habits. Okay, so I just wanted to say that because when you asked your question, it made me think about that. Now, in terms of the decision making, you know, and determining, you know, what do you track and what you don't, it ultimately has to boil down to, you know, what are the critical success factors for your organization or for your startup in this time period. And so in the first year, what are the make it or break it factors that you need to be aware of at all times? And so, you know, that's where you begin. And again, it may be 10 things that you need, 10 things that are out there. But of those 10, I mean, whatever the number is, usually it's like 5 or 3 or whatever it is. But you want to understand what are your make it or break it factors that you need to be aware of at all times so that you can respond. Because the whole point of this is not just to track data, it's not to generate reports, it's to be able to make good decisions, which is why you begin, with identifying your risks and your opportunities, so that that can in turn influence the decisions you make about where you deploy resources, where you pull back, what changes you make and how quickly you do that. So that's why this has to be a continuous process, and it's about building that discipline. Yes?
Thank you.
This is actually an amazing session, even as an existing entrepreneur, because a lot of times when we are doing our business, we're working in our business and not always on our business. So this is a great mindset shift to work on your business and to look at your own systems. And I think the greatest incentive to look for systems and the reason why you want to create one is revenue.
Yes.
Because you need to know how are you making your money.
Yes.
And when you can follow the steps to when a deal closes and when you get an order and when you get the revenue, then that's the moment to stop and say, okay, what did I do? What were the steps that got me here? And then the next question is, that you should ask yourself to help to influence creating a system is, how do I make more of this? So that will get you back into...
How do I make more of it? That means you need to spend more on marketing.
Well, not necessarily. Marketing might not be the key if that wasn't the way that the revenue came in. Maybe the revenue came in from networking here, and you might say, I need to spend more time at targeted events where my customers are. And maybe that's the investment that you make. It might not be spending money putting together marketing systems, but I think having that awareness and always just being in tune with your business and not taking it for granted because revenue is coming in. Because we can make money. The question is, can we keep making money from the same customer, or are we chasing new money every time? So I think those are the questions that we get to ask ourselves, even when we've been in business for a while.
I just follow up to that,
All right.
your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well put.
Right, because, that's why I said, a very important question to ask is, what did I do right?
Yeah.
Instead of, again, always focusing on, okay, what went wrong? Because when you ask yourself, okay, I closed this deal. Now, what went right about this deal? Then you're able to capture things that you can repeat, training and education that you need to share. You can begin to, because all of this is also about efficiency, so that you can replicate excellence in an efficient manner rather than working hard, trying to figure things out, and so you're always responding. So I'm going to go to your question and then to you.
Okay. Well, the question I have is about learning. I also work. I'm a doctor, so I work in the healthcare sector. In the government department, we find that sometimes many doctors do not have very good communication skills. So am I right?
Somebody else knows other than me.
Yeah. Please pardon me. Even the handwriting.
Okay. Keeping the handwriting aside, you talked about adaptive learning and generative learning. So I wanted to ask you, with your experience in the health sector, what proportion of the learning is more important, and how do we go about, really, because I want my doctors and my staff in my hospital to really be, as you said, to be better leaders, because many of them are not. Some of them are very good professionals. They perform good surgeries, but their PR skill is So what can I do about that?
Yes, that is a very great question, and it's actually something that I've had to deal with, in this whole process. Because one of the challenges, particularly with physicians and any other organization, whatever your highest skilled professional is in that organization, is time. And also getting them to understand the value of communication skills or taking a class in something that's not directly generated to taking care of the patient. So one of the things that I found that I had to do was, if I went in and said, I'm going to give you an example, like in health, in the United States, we have this law called EMTALA, Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, I think is what it is. But anyway, basically what it says is that if a patient shows up in the ER, you have to treat them. You can't turn them away if they don't have insurance, okay? So this was a consistent challenge for us because within that were a lot of different technical things that the hospital was responsible for, yet it was the physicians that had to carry it out. So my initial response was to go to them and say, y'all must take EMTALA training because they've got to understand what these fundamental things are. Well, as you can imagine, they did not go over very well because they didn't want to be told what it was that they didn't want to be told what to do. So one of the things that I had to learn was, what are the, most physicians or professionals, whatever the industry is, they want to do great work. It's very rare that you have somebody who just doesn't care and doesn't want to be a better leader and doesn't want to do better. But I had to understand what are the incentives that are going to influence this physician to want to do better. And the thing I had to learn, I had to talk to them, and which is why it is important in this education process, is that communication is a key component of that. Listening to them in terms of what are their priorities, what are their fears, and you may not, physicians typically are not going to readily say, I'm afraid of, but in listening to them and understanding what their challenges are, you can gather that. But the thing that I ultimately found was that what physicians cared the most about was being able to deliver health care to their patients in the most efficient manner. And anything that took away from that time at the bedside, they didn't want to hear it. So you had to get them to tell you and be a part of the process, how tie in what it is you want them to do to being able to achieve that goal. So, being a better leader helps them to communicate with the healthcare delivery team more. You can, if you can communicate to a nurse in a more efficient manner, well, then your orders are going to get carried out in a quicker time frame. So that's where communication is more efficient or more, it's beneficial to the physician. So it's all about the listening process and going in with, okay, here is an outcome we'd like to achieve. What are your thoughts on that? How do you think it can be achieved? Because a lot of times what you'll find is the solution that your actual delivery person at the front line, their solution is a lot better than anything you could have come up with yourself. So listening to them, understanding their priorities, their fears, their motivation, and the things that are demotivations to them.
I just wanted to share, I have a question. So I've worked with Regis Business Centers, the world's largest business center company. And I was leading their West market for India. And what I've learned from them is phenomenal. So first is they focus a lot on training, a lot. So as a region head, it was my responsibility to continuously train my team on the same aspects every fortnight. And that was a part of my KRA. Number one. Number two is they were very quick on implementation. So, and they kept a sharp eye on each employee's performance globally, which meant that if one of my team members is doing phenomenal business month after month after month, team from Hong Kong or somewhere will come down, interview that team member and sit down with me and say, what is it that this person is doing different that is making her or him perform so much continuously. Once those nuances were identified, which that person was probably doing, a pilot project would be led in another country. That is it specific to that region, or is it successful in another region in the same format? If it's successful in another region in the same format, immediately the processes will be changed and a new process would be rolled out, saying that, okay, the new system is this, and if you follow this, you will succeed. And then again, the trainings will go on and on and on. Right. So I think that's a huge learning that I had, that one needs to keep a sharp eye on what is it right, like you said, that what or different that your team member is, a performing team member is doing, which can be replicated across the board.
Right. Right, and I think it's important to, again, make this a part of the way you do business. And I think back to like when I was beginning to implement this whole performance improvement process at my organization. One of the things that I did was just assessments where we were able to obtain, objective criteria that would help us to understand how different functions in the hospital were performing. And it was just it was checklists. It was asking, do you have these policies? How do you handle this? I mean, just different things that you could do. And I remember when we were beginning this process, I sent my team into one of the units, and kind of the immediate response of that leader was, well, my goodness, we're not doing anything wrong. Why are you coming to look at us? And so that was very telling of the culture, because this is all about driving a culture of excellence, okay? And prior to implementing this system, the culture was we didn't come and look at you until there was a problem. So it's really important in communication, in involving people in the process, that they understand that the assessment is not done to find out what you're doing wrong. It's part of this understanding what are you doing and how is that impacting your performance. What are the things that you're doing great right now, and what are some things that you need to improve. So culture is a very important part of this entire process. And then so that's kind of the macro focus is, the culture, but also you've got to get down to the individual. And I always call this the WEF, what's in it for me. People have to understand how they are a part of the overall success of the organization. Because in driving cultural changes and in instituting excellence as part of a culture in an organization, it boils down to each individual having ownership in the outcome. And, unless it's a cooperative organization, employee shareholders, they don't get the direct benefit of the revenue. Okay, they get their paycheck, but they're not necessarily sharing in the profit, so they don't really get that. Okay, but if you help them to understand how, when the company is profitable, these are the influences, positive influences on you as an individual. Well, then they are more likely to care about the different metrics. So that's something that is really important in the education component, is making sure that everybody in that organization knows how they make a positive contribution to the outcomes. And how, when they, again, don't show up, don't do well, the impact that has on the organization and how that flows back to them. And then also making sure that they have a way of validating their own performance. And it could be something very simple, because I remember, one of the things that I did too was study other healthcare entities, for example, that were performing consistently well. And one of the overwhelming similarities in those organizations was that each individual employee, whether it was someone in environmental services who was responsible for cleaning up the patient rooms, all the way up to the CEO, everybody had a personal scorecard that had one metric in each, so they had 5 pillars of excellence or 3 pillars of excellence. Everybody had at least one personal metric that they could say, if I do this consistently every day in these 5 areas, I'm going to be able to contribute to the overall success of the organization. And that engendered a greater loyalty, a greater participation, and people felt involved and really cared about whether the organization hit those metrics. So that's something that's really important, is understanding the cultural influences on excellence and then drilling it down to the individual and making sure that they understand how they impact the outcomes for the organization and get them excited about it. Okay, any other questions? Let's see, how are we doing on time? Yeah, we've got about 9 minutes, I think. Yes, we still have time. So what are some questions or other comments or thoughts around this process?
Anybody who would like to ask something?
Okay, thank you, and thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Let's have a photograph.
Yes.